All right, I'm Rachel Woody, and I'm here with Tom Branigar. It's March 31st, 2015, and we're here in the Nicholson Library. And Tom, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Okay, I'm Thomas Branigar. I was born in Salem, Oregon, grew up in Monmouth in Polk County, which is about 25 miles south of McMinnville. I came to Linfield as a freshman in the fall of 1970, graduated in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in mathematics and a minor in history. Then I went to Western Washington State University in Bellingham for my graduate work in archives and records management. I got my master's degree there in 1976. Then I worked for the university for a year on a special grant program to research the records of public utility districts in the Pacific Northwest. Then after working there for a year, I was hired by the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, where I worked for 31 years as a processing archivist. I helped organize the White House records, the National Security Advisor's files, the records of several members of the administration. I retired in 2008 and moved back to Oregon. I'm now living in the Salem area, and I'm doing volunteer work for the Polk County Historical Society. They have a little museum in Rickreall that has some manuscript collections. I'm helping to organize those to keep myself busy in my dotage.
Wonderful, thank you. So we like to start these interviews out by asking why Linfield?
Okay, well, I had some definite criteria I was looking for in a college. I was something of a homebody, so I wanted someplace close to Monmouth so I could get home on weekends. And you're probably thinking Western Oregon University, which is right there in Monmouth. The problem was in the 1960s when I was growing up, it was Oregon College of Education, and it was mostly focused on training teachers. And I did not want to be a teacher, mainly because I'm a recluse and I dreaded the thought of facing a room full of students every day. And my parents were both teachers. In fact, they'd gone to OCE in the 1940s. And so they were very good teachers, and I knew I could never be as good as they were. I didn't want to feel like I was following in their footsteps. And my parents encouraged this. They said, find your own path, something you can do well in and you enjoyed. So I started looking around for a college when I was a junior in high school. And I'd taken a tour of the Oregon State University campus in Corvallis. And it was such a huge, overwhelming place with crowds of students, and I knew I didn't want a big college like that. So I was focusing on the small private colleges in the Willamette Valley, and which would be more expensive since it wouldn't be state schools. And so I needed some place that would offer a financial aid package. So I started collecting material, and people said good things about Linfield, but I had one little problem. There was, in the 60s, there was a policy where students had to attend chapel every week. And my parents were not religious. They were very skeptical of organized religion. And a lot of that rubbed off on me. And so the thought of being forced to attend religious services made me very uncomfortable. So I didn't consider Linfield at first. In the summer of '69, my family went to Portland to visit my mother's college roommate. And her husband was a graduate of Reed College in Portland. And when I said I had an interest in math and science, he said, well, you ought to consider Reed because it has a very strong science program. So he drove me over to the campus and gave me a quick tour. It was a nice campus, but it was right surrounded by Portland. So you had traffic, noise, pollution, crime, and I saw hippies everywhere, long-haired, bearded hippies that seemed to hang out on the campus. So I was not very impressed. And he was telling me about the intense pressure the students were under. There was a high dropout rate because they couldn't handle the stress of the classwork. So that made me rather uncomfortable. Then in the fall of '69, there was a conference at Willamette University, I think in September. And the guidance counselors at Central High School were encouraging people to go on into college, and so they took a carload of us over to the Willamette to attend the conference. I went to the session on Reed College, and another hippie, long-haired, bearded fellow, not very presentable, and he had done no background work at all. He just gave a long, rambling, disorganized talk. It was very uninformative. So I went to the session on Linfield just to see what was going on. And here was Ann Goss and Frank Molick from the admissions office, and they did a wonderful job, cheerful, enthusiastic. They had handouts, all sorts of background information. So that pretty well convinced me that Linfield might be worth investigating. And they told me an interesting story. It seemed that they just hired a new president named Gordon Bjork, who was trying to liberalize the college. And one of the changes he had made was dropping the requirement that people attend chapel. So that pretty well convinced me that Linfield might be worth investigating. So another thing that happened was the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. I had taken it my junior year in high school because it would help me, if I could do well enough, I would be eligible for financial aid. So in September, around the same time as this conference in Willamette, the guidance counselor called me into her office and she said, "Congratulations, you've got a letter of commendation," which I guess was the highest score at Central High School that year. And she said, "We can send the test results to 2 different colleges. Which would you like?" So I said, Reed College and Linfield College. Well, I never heard from Reed College again. But in October, the following month, I got this letter from the president of the college, Gordon Bjork. He said, "Congratulations on your scores, and we hope you will consider attending Linfield." You know, I was young and naive in those days, and I thought, wow, a personal letter from the president of the college. So it was largely that letter and the presentation by Ann Goss and Frank Molick that convinced me that Linfield would be the place to go. So in November, they had an open house for potential students and their parents. And so my mother brought me up here to McMinnville, and I remember this very well because we had a reception at the president's house, and then there was a conference in the Linfield Little Theater in Fryricks Hall. And this was the month before the building burned down. So I got to see it before it was destroyed. But the conference was a briefing for the parents on financial aid programs. So my mother went to the conference and I had a chance to explore the campus. So I went through Northup Library and fell in love with the building. You know, all these little nooks and crannies where I could just hide and read quietly. So I knew I'd be spending a lot of time there. Then I walked over to Riley Hall to explore the student center. Then I walked out to the south end of the campus, and here was an observatory with a real telescope. I was so impressed because I had an interest in astronomy. I thought, well, maybe they'll offer an astronomy course. So after the briefing, Mom said that because of my good scores, I was pretty much assured of getting some financial aid. So then they had treated us to a buffet dinner in Riley Hall. I mean, in Dillon Commons. And I remember that very well because Mom wanted to get more information about the college. So we sat at the same table as Tom Miko, who was one of the deans. And so Mom was talking to him about the college, and once everyone sat down, he stood up and gave a few words of welcome. And it turned out he was the master of ceremonies at the dinner. And so he told everyone about the college and how we were all welcome. And then he said, well, let's go through the buffet line. So start here and that table and that table. And since he couldn't very well start with his own table, my mother and I ended up last at the very end of the line.
Oh no.
And so after dinner, we went back home. And so I was very impressed. And so in January of '70, I applied for admission and got accepted. And they gave me a financial aid program, I think it was a $1,000 scholarship for the year, which helped make the college affordable. And I also got a $200 research grant from the Linfield Research Institute. And part of the requirement for that is that I had to attend a series of lectures sponsored by the Linfield Research Institute. They would bring scientists in to give talks about their research. I found that very fascinating. Even after the grant ran out after the first year, I still went to all the lectures I could. The other requirement was that I take 2 mechanical courses. One was on machine shop and the other was on glass blowing. And I had a miserable time in those because I have no mechanical skills at all. In fact, the machine shop was taught by Walter Heinrichs, who was the head of buildings and grounds at that time. And noticed he had part of one of his fingers was missing, which was not very, not a confidence builder. No. And so all this heavy machinery, they had something called a nibbler that would take little pieces out of scrap metal. They had a spot welder that would weld 2 things together. And then had a shaver, which is shave pieces off the top of a metal plate in order to smooth it out. And I was very uncomfortable with that. And so I barely passed the course. And then the second course was glass blowing. And that was in the basement of Graff Hall. And they had a lathe which you could put a piece of glass in and then rotate it. And they had a gas jet where you could blow hot flames over the glass in order to melt it. And I did very poorly in that class. In fact, there was one place where we had to make look like the base of a light bulb with a brown piece of glass and wires sticking through it. And I could never get that right. And I worked out for hours and hours and had to go through 2 or 3 different tests to get it just exactly right. And I finally got it right and reached over to turn the machine off, and I brushed it against it and knocked it on the floor and shattered all over the floor. And I almost cried with frustration.
Yeah.
You know, after putting up with this for a whole semester, I failed the course. It's the only course I failed at Linfield.
Oh no.
And not through lack of trying, it's just through my total absence of mechanical skills. So that was basically my introduction to mechanical work, and I knew to steer clear of that in the future.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
But they kept up the scholarship throughout my 4 years at Linfield, so I ended up being able to afford to stay here, and I think I did fairly well because it was Linfield that stimulated my interest in history as a profession.
Yes, in fact, why don't you tell us about how you went from being a math major and a history minor to discovering that you were actually very passionate about history?
Okay, well, I've always had an interest in history. I started tracing my own family when I was 9 years old. My grandmother would take me to family reunions when I was in grade school, and I got to meet all these fascinating relatives. And on my dad's side, I'm descended from an old pioneer family of Oregon. My ancestors had come out by wagon train in 1852. In fact, one of them settled down to Sheridan in southern Yamhill County. So one of the things I was able to do when I was here is walk downtown in the afternoons when I didn't have a class and go to the courthouse. I'd look up their probate records and find all the relatives I could trace. That was really interesting. But that was more of a hobby. I never thought really at first of becoming a historian as a profession. And this was largely due to my experiences in high school. Central High School had a very strong athletic program. They would hire teachers for their coaching ability, and then in order to give them something to do outside of the gym, they would have them teach history and social studies, and a lot of them did not do very well in those fields. And so all the good teachers were in math and science. So I ended up really enjoying math and science as the academic aspect. In fact, I can tell you a really good story that illustrates some of the problems I had in high school. One year, Central offered a course in physical geography. And since I always enjoyed reading maps, I thought it might be something I could use. So I signed up for the course. It turned out to be taught by the wrestling coach, and he had no knowledge of geography. He'd sit in front of the class and read to us out of the textbook. And it was almost like he was trying to educate himself along with the students. And one day, he had us write a report on an island. And not just any island. He put a list of the biggest islands in the world in a little box, and we draw out a name and write a report on that island. Well, I got stuck with Victoria Island, which is one of those huge islands in the Canadian Arctic. There's nothing up there. I found one little paragraph in the encyclopedia, not enough to do a full-scale report on. So I thought, I was getting desperate. I thought, well, maybe I can pull a fast one on the teacher since he doesn't know anything about geography. So I went to Mr. Drill and I said, well, I can't find anything on Victoria Island. Can I write about Victoria on Vancouver Island? And he said, sure. He probably didn't know the difference, but Victoria's the capital of British Columbia. My family had been there on vacation. So I had maps and I had photographs and I had tourist literature. I wrote a 3-page report on the harbor in downtown Victoria, and I ended up getting an A in the course.
Well done.
So studying history is more, how can I avoid the teachers and study this on my own? So it was more of a hobby. So when I would complain to my parents about incompetent teachers, they would say, well, things will be different in college. Your teachers will be experts in their field, they'll know the subject matter, they'll do a good job. So I was really looking forward to getting to Linfield. And so in the fall of my freshman year, I signed up for all the math courses I could find. And another Dr. Bjork's innovations, they just done a major reorganization of the curriculum in the summer of 1970. So I was in the first class to come in under this new system. And they set up something called core courses. There were, I think, 6 major subject areas. And each student was required to take a survey course in each of those areas in order to get a good, well-rounded education. Then they had requirements where you take a certain number of courses in your major field of study, and then everything else was elective, so you could take anything that struck your fancy. And so I discovered that one of the core courses was languages, and they had offered French, German, Spanish, and I had taken 1 semester of Spanish in high school, and I had a miserable time because I have no talent for foreign languages. But I discovered they were letting you use computer programming as a foreign language. So I signed up for computer programming as my communications course the fall of my freshman year. And I also signed up for math course, Calculus 1 from Robert Jones in the physics department. And then I also signed up for, chemistry physics. It was a brand new course they were offering. And it was a combination of chemistry and physics. And Hayden Pittman taught the chemistry part, and Robert Jones taught the physics part. And it was a 2-semester course. And since I had expressed an interest in math and science, they assigned me a student advisor, and it was Dr. Clarence Heinrichs in the physics department. And the problem with Dr. Heinrichs, he was also a college registrar, so he was very busy. It was hard to get hold of him when I needed him. In fact, I can tell you one story. He sent a message to all of the students saying he wanted to meet them in his office. And so half of us went to the registrar's office in Melrose, the other half went to the physics office in Graff Hall. And so a bit confusing. And so, but he actually invited us to his house one evening to meet his family. So that was a nice interlude. But the chemistry physics course turned out to be very difficult. They assumed a preliminary knowledge of calculus. It said I had no calculus classes in high school. So it was very rough. And Dr. Pittman took us into Taylor Hall, the chemistry labs, and he had us do some experiments. And I found that very rough because I had no mechanical skills and had trouble mixing the chemicals. And so I was under so much pressure that I decided to drop the class after the first semester. And I went to Dr. Heinrichs and said I'd like to drop the second half of the chemistry physics course. He was surprised. He asked why, and so I explained about having trouble with no calculus background and all the intense pressure. And he actually thanked me for my comments. Since it was a new course, they weren't sure how it would fly with the students. So I was kind of grateful for his reaction. I wasn't a quitter, I was just overwhelmed at the course. And so, but the computer class I really enjoyed because it was Dr. Elmer Frick who taught it. He was a short, roly-poly fellow, always cheerful, outgoing type person. Whenever I think of him, the phrase mischievous elf comes to mind. So I really enjoyed Dr. Frick's classes. And so by this fall of my freshman year, I was pretty well set on math instead of physics and science, chemistry. So second semester, spring of '71, I took Calculus 2 from Dr. Dolan. And I can tell you some stories about Dr. Dolan. Very saintly man, very thoughtful, considerate of the students. He always took time to go through our papers and explain what we were doing wrong and how we might improve. And I brought one paper that I can show you.
Yes, please.
I had a very unpleasant experience in grade school. The teacher had given us a list of words, and we would use each word in a sentence to show that we knew what it meant and that we could use it properly. And since I was a fairly good writer, I was able to use 3 or 4 words in one sentence, and it saved a lot of time. And I thought, well, he'll be really pleased at how efficient I am. So I turned the work in. When I got it back, he'd mark me down and said, "Tom, you were lazy." Turned out he'd wanted a separate sentence for each word. I was not very happy. And so when I got one of my first calculus papers for Dr. Dolan, we were in Calculus 2 studying logarithms. And he gave us an assignment to figure out the value of different logarithms. And I did the first question with no problem. And the second question, I discovered that I could use some of the results from my first problem to make the second problem easier. And of course, I remembered this paper I'd done in grade school where I got marked down for not doing all the work. And so I thought, well, I'll try this and see what Dr. Dolan says. So I copied some of the results from the first question into the second question, and he wrote on my problem, "You are one of the few who used results of one problem to abbreviate the next, a sound principle." And I'm so proud of Dr. Dolan for indicating this. He was always quick to praise students for doing good work. And that's one of the reasons why I respect him so much. In fact, I ended up taking 4 courses from him: Calculus 2, Calculus 3, and Advanced Calculus 1 and 2. And I can tell you a couple stories about the advanced calculus courses. By that time, there were very few students left because calculus was so difficult. But I had a lot of fun in the courses, and I really enjoyed the work. And by the time of calculus 1 and 2, there were so few students left, he was able to meet with each of us individually. And so on one occasion, I can't remember which class it was, he had us meet him one at a time in his office, and he would have us solve a problem on the chalkboard next to his desk, and that way he could follow our work. And when it came time to go to his office, I'd pick the problem out of the textbook that I wanted to solve. But his office was a little interior room on the second floor of Graff Hall that year. There were no windows, and it was stifling hot. So I pointed out the problem in the textbook that I was going to solve. And I said, I'm going to solve this by mathematical induction. And he looked kind of surprised. He said, are you sure? And I said, yes, because I'd done the work and knew I could do it. Mm-hmm. And mathematical induction is a two-step process. First, you prove it for one specific case. Mm-hmm. Then you prove that since it's true for that one case, it's true for all other cases. So I started on the first half, and I proved it for that one specific case with no trouble. Then I started on the second general proof. And I was running out of space on the chalkboard. So I erased part of the stuff I'd done for the first half of the problem, and I started working on the second half. And I suddenly realized, I'd erased part of the information I needed to prove the second half of the problem. And I was getting more and more flustered. And by this time I was dripping with sweat because it was so hot. So I started to write the information that erased, and Dr. Dolan said, don't bother, I see what you're trying to do. So he was doing his best to put me at ease and help me get through the problem. Yeah. So I've always respected him for that. Mm-hmm. And in advanced calculus 2, it was in the fall of late spring of '74 when I was a senior. I was getting ready to graduate, and he was getting ready to retire because he was 65 years old that year. Mm-hmm. And I think it was one of the last classes he ever taught as full professor. And there were only 4 students left in the class. There was Dave Hall, Shelley Shin, myself, and Martha Barbie. And he had each one of us get up in front of the class and give a lecture about a specific problem. And it had something to do with imaginary numbers, which was the advanced calculus part. Mm-hmm. And so I gave a talk on the space-time continuum, because there was a scientist named Minkowski who figured out a way to put a 4-dimensional space reduced to a 2-dimensional graph. And so in an accelerated frame, the sides of the graph would contract, and that involved an imaginary number in the equation. So I told how I came up with this graph and how it worked to represent the space-time continuum. And then at the very end, I told how imaginary numbers would fit into this. So I don't think I did a very good job, because it was just one little part at the very end of my talk. Ended up getting to be in the class. But Martha Barbie got up and she gave a geometry problem, a complicated equation with an imaginary number in the equation, and how it explained a certain type of figure. And she did such a good job of explaining that. I was very impressed, and I still remember what a good job she did. And now she's Martha Barbie Van Cleave, and she's a math professor at Linfield. So I'm not surprised at all that she's doing good work. Mm-hmm. She was a year behind the class of '75. And then when graduation came around at the end of May, Dr. Dolan helped hand out the diplomas, and he gave an interesting farewell address, kind of saying he was retiring. And he said he'd first come to Linfield in 1947, which is 27 years earlier. Mm-hmm. And some of the people who were graduating with me were children of people who had been at Linfield when he first came. And then he said something to the effect that, if I'm still around in 27 years, I hope you'll wheel me in and I can watch your children graduate. Mm. And it turned out he lived to be 100 years old, and he was around 27 years after that date, which I've always found interesting. I wonder if somebody remembered what he had said in '74 when we graduated. Mm-hmm. But that's my stories about Dr. Dolan. He was such a wonderful person. Unfortunately, by the time I got to the end of my sophomore year, I realized that I enjoyed math and I was fairly well at it, but not good enough to earn a living in the field. And if I would not be good enough to get a job where I'd have to use my math skills, I'd probably have to become a math teacher someplace, and I did not want to be a teacher. So in the fall of '71, started my sophomore year, I was going through the catalog, and I discovered they were offering a course on Pacific Northwest history. in the history department. And I'd never considered taking a history course. And so, and it was an upper division course. I think it was History 435, Pacific Northwest, which was a senior level course. I thought they'll never let a lowly sophomore in. So, but I thought, well, I could maybe treat it as an elective. So I went to see Elmer Millian, who was the chairman of the history department, and he would be teaching the course. And I said, well, I'm just a lowly sophomore, and I'm a major in math, and I don't know if I'll do very well, but I'm interested in Pacific Northwest history, and I'm from an old pioneer family. Maybe it'd help me understand my family background. And he said, sure. He allowed me to get into the course. Best decision ever made, because we had a very interesting time. Dr. Millian was an expert on the missionaries, told about all the missionaries and their early contribution to Oregon history, and we used Empire of the Columbia by Johansen and Gates as the textbook, which was probably the best general survey of Pacific Northwest history. And so as part of the course, we took a field trip to Salem. And he got us a tour of the state archives. And at that time, the state archives on the top floor of the Oregon State Library. And the state archives reported to the state librarian, who was kind of their supervisor. And the state archivist at that time was David Dunaway. He'd actually set up the state archives in 1947 and been its archivist for over 20 years. And so he gave us a tour of the archives. We carpooled down to Salem. The students got together, and I rode with Tim Matheson, who was actually a resident of Anderson Hall, which was my dorm. So I knew him, and we got together, and he gave me a ride to Salem. And we went through the state archives. David Dunaway himself gave us a tour and showed us some old documents. And he pulled out a document from the Secretary of State's office of Linfield's charter that had been filed with the state. So I was very impressed with that. It got me interested in working with old documents. He showed us some of the territorial governors' files, which were in the state archives. And so as part of our training in the class, we had to write a research paper. Well, I'd been doing volunteer work for the County Historical Society in Polk County. I'd started copying some of the old tombstones in the local cemeteries, going through the old newspapers to find obituaries of the early pioneers. And there was a fellow named Cyrenius Hooker who died in 1852 and was buried in a little pioneer cemetery near Rickreall. And when I found a notice of his death, it turned out he'd been murdered. So when I had to find a research topic for the paper, my history paper, the murder of Cyrenius C. Hooker, I decided to do research on the murder. It turned out to be a very interesting subject. It was the first murder in Polk County. This Hooker was an early pioneer, and a transient who was staying in the area had murdered him, stolen his pocket watch, broke into his cabin and stole his pocket watch. And when Hooker accused him of the crime, the guy got upset and murdered Hooker and then took off for California. So they sent a posse out to capture him and his friends and brought them back to Polk County. Then they didn't have a jail to put the men in. So they had to clear out a storeroom on the second floor of the county courthouse and load them with leg irons and tie them to the wall so they couldn't escape because there was no jail at the time. Then they took him to trial in the courthouse. It was the first murder trial in Polk County. They found the guy guilty and hanged him next to the courthouse on a little scaffold they built. It was the first hanging in Polk County. Wow. And then one of his friends was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. And so they were going to hang him. So the guy managed to get his leg irons off his feet and jumped out the second story window and took off and disappeared. So they had to send another posse to capture the guy. And so it was the first jailbreak in Polk County history. And they finally managed to track him down at a barn here in Yamhill County, in southern part of the county near Amity. So they hauled him back, convicted him, and they're going to hang him as well. Then political aspects began to get involved. The judge who sentenced him was a Whig, a fellow named Orville C. Pratt. The governor at that time was George Curry, who was a Democrat. And so there was some political rivalry involved. And people began to write to Governor Curry to say, please pardon this guy, because the guy who sentenced him was a Whig and your political rival. And there was one guy named Nathaniel Ford who lived in the Rickreall Valley near where the crime had taken place. And Everman, the murderer, after he was hanged, it turned out he had made a second confession saying that this other guy had had nothing to do with it. And so Nathaniel Ford wrote a letter to Governor Curry and said, I did believe that Everman was the man that laid the whole plan to murder Hooker. But since Everman has made his confession public, I've changed my opinion. And I now believe this guy was just an accomplice and doesn't deserve to be hanged. You know, it's one of those perfect documents that every historian dreams of finding. Something that says exactly the right phrasing, and it's a form that's easily quotable. And I found it in the governor's papers in the territorial archives at the state archives. So I used that in the paper, and so the governor pardoned him, and he went to Lane County, where he got a donation land claim near Eugene, and it ended up committing suicide in 1877. So he didn't have a very happy life afterwards. But I wrote all this up and got an A on the paper. In fact, Dr. Milling liked it so much, he says, an impressive job of research and writing, beautiful. And he liked it so much, he suggested I send it to the Oregon Historical Society in Portland. And they liked it so much that they agreed to publish it. It's in the December 1974 issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. But I was only 18 when I wrote this, so I think I'm one of their younger contributors.
I bet you are.
So but that's how I got interested in history as a profession. Since I enjoyed the course so much, I decided to get a minor in history. So I took all the other history courses I could find. History of U.S. history in the 19th century from Dr. Millian, English history and American Civ from Dr. Beckham, early modern Europe from Dr. Jacobs, and European Civ from Dr. Beckham. He also taught English history. So I had 3 from Millian, 2 from Beckham, 3 from Beckham, and 1 from Jacobs. And when it comes to comparing the history professors, I really like Dr. Beckham because he later became an expert on American Indians. He was very enthusiastic, dynamic. He would pace back and forth and wave his arms and write on the blackboard with a dramatic flourish. You could tell he was really enthusiastic about his courses. Dr. Milling was more relaxed and laid back. Great sense of humor, always cracking jokes. Dr. Jacobs is more stiff and formal. I didn't like his work quite as well as the other two, but I learned a lot from him. In fact, in his early modern European class, he gave us the option of either writing a research paper or getting up in front of the class and giving a lecture. Well, I hadn't done much in the way of public speaking, and I thought it might be a good experience. So I gave a talk on Marshal Bernadotte, who was the French general who became King of Sweden at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And I ended up getting an A in the class, so I guess I didn't do too badly. But some of the other history courses I enjoyed were History of the American West by Dr. Beckham. See, I think part of the problem with Beckham and Millian is that they both specialized in U.S. history. Dr. Beckham specialized in American Indians, Dr. Millian specialized in the missionaries. So I think there was a bit of professional rivalry there, especially since Millian was the chairman of the history department. And so Dr. Beckham was only there for about 10 years, and they transferred to Lewis and Clark College in Portland. Spent something like 30 years there, the rest of his career, and became widely known for his work on Indian history. So I don't think he was really very happy at Linfield, but I certainly enjoyed his classes. But I took his course on history of the American West in the spring of my senior year, spring of '74. And there was another history research paper I had to write. And I was doing research on Polk County again, and I found there had been a lynching in Dallas in 1887. So I thought that might make a good research article. So I tracked down all the newspaper accounts I could find, which were pretty detailed. And my mother was reading teacher at Independence Elementary School. And she was telling some of her fellow teachers about my work, my research on this lynching. And one of her fellow teachers, Mrs. Hamilton, spoke up and said, "Oh, I know all about that." Turned out her husband was the great-grandson of the railroad agent in McCoy, Oregon, who had provided Oscar Kelly with the murder weapon. He had murdered his wife, and her friends and neighbors took him out and lynched him. They broke into the county jail next to the courthouse and hanged him from an oak tree across the street. And he had murdered his wife. He had a trunk in storage at the McCoy Railroad Depot. So he went to the McCoy Railroad Depot and asked the railroad agent to get his trunk for him because he had a gun in storage. And he said, I'm going to go hunting gophers tomorrow. And the railroad agent didn't realize what he was planning to do, so he just handed him the gun, and the guy rode off and shot his wife. And the railroad agent lived to be 89 years old and told all his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, the story of how he provided the murder weapon. And his great-grandson's wife was a friend of my mother, and so she got me an interview with her mother-in-law, who is a granddaughter, and she heard the story straight from the source, the railroad agent himself. So I did oral history interviews for this research paper and did all the research in the old newspapers. And there was no trial because it was decided at the justice of the peace level where they decided to bind him over for the murder. And so he was hanged before, he was lynched before they could bring him to trial. So there was no court records. And so, but I found, they tracked down the guy who was accused of leading the lynch mob. And they brought him to trial in Dallas. And there was, that was decided at the justice of the peace level as well. And so there was no court documents because they decided there was not enough evidence to convict him. So, but I found the newspaper accounts of that. And so I wrote a little article, a research paper, the lynching of Oscar Kelty. And he said, excellent work, Tom. Dr. Beckham said this. Your research is very thorough and your assessment is sound. I'm very pleased how you assessed the broader implications of this event. And he gave me a 99. And the reason I didn't get a full credit is because I forgot to underline the names of the newspapers in my footnote. So it was a matter of writing, not of research, that I got marked down on this one. So that was an interesting experience. But it was all this work in history that made me realize that history was worth pursuing as a profession because I discovered I could do fairly well in it. And I enjoyed working with old documents, doing the research. In fact, the reason I didn't get a major, a dual major, one of the requirements for a history major is that I had to take a course on a research seminar in my senior year. And that was how to write a research paper, how to do research, how to analyze sources. The two research papers I'd written had both gotten A's and they were both accepted for publication. Because this one on the lynching, I gave to the Polk County Historical Society and they put it out in one of their pamphlets. So I figured I didn't exactly need to know how to write a research paper since I was doing fairly well. So I skipped the course and I got a minor in history. And I was talking with Dr. Milligan several years later. I'd come back on vacation. And he said, why didn't you get a major? And I said, well, I didn't want to take the course because I thought it would be a waste of time. He said, well, you should have told us. We would have granted you a waiver and you could have gotten a major without taking the course. And I didn't know they could do that. And so I ended up with a minor instead of a major. So,
it seems you've done just fine.
Mm-hmm. And so, in fact, they were the ones who helped me get into graduate school because I was looking around for a graduate school in history with maybe archival work. And I applied to the University of Oregon during my senior year. And they said, well, they were all filled up. So I started driving around to other colleges. I went to Portland State University in Portland to see if they had a graduate course in history. And I was talking with a Dr. Burke in their history department. He said, well, if you like working with old documents, I've just heard about a new course they have up at Western Washington University that trains people who work in archives. And only been in operation for 2 or 3 years. I'm still fairly new. So I came running back to Linfield. I went to see Dr. Beckham. And I said, do you know anything about this archival training course at Western? He said, I just got back from a conference. I heard about that. It's supposed to be really good. So I applied up there and got accepted. And I would have to pay out-of-state tuition at Western. Then it turned out I had a great aunt living in Bellingham. And she let me camp out in her basement the first year. So I saved a lot of money on board and room. And then by the end of my first year at Western, I got a job in the college archives. They just rented a new building and they had to put up all the shelving, so I helped do that. And that paid my way through my second year of graduate school. And so I got a master's degree in archives and records management. And they have a very good placement program. One of the people that I went through the training course with ended up as state archivist of California, and another got hired in American Samoa, and several went to the Washington State Archives. One became the city archivist of Seattle. And one fellow named Rod Sobers went to the Eisenhower Library. in 1975, the year after the training course. And so as part of the training course, we had to do a 6-month internship at an archives, and I got assigned to the regional archives in Seattle, the National Archives branch. And so Rod Sobers already had his master's degree. So he did his training course at there in the spring of '75, and he got to organize the Yakima Indian Agency records. He did all the correspondence files, all the sexy stuff. And when I got there the following year, I had to clean up after him, and I did all the deeds and the leases and the check vouchers and all the routine stuff that nobody's interested in. Then it turned out that the federal government had been cheating the Indians out of their money. And so all of a sudden everybody wanted to look at the deeds and the receipts and the check vouchers. And so the stuff I organized has the most use.
Thank goodness you were the one in charge of it.
Kind of. But he got a job at the Eisenhower Library in the fall of '75. And so after getting my master's degree, the college, Western Washington University, got an NHPRC grant to study the records of public utility districts in the Pacific Northwest. And so PUDs are very popular up in Washington. Just about every county has one, and there are only 4 in Oregon. So they assign everyone in the class to inventory the records in Washington, and I was assigned to cover the entire state of Oregon. So I was based at the State Archives in Salem as an intern in the spring of '76. And by this time, no, wait a minute, spring of '77, because this the year after I got my master's degree. By that time, J.D. Porter was the state archivist, because David Dunaway had retired, and they moved the state archives to a warehouse on North Broadway Street in Salem. They had the big building with all the records stored in it. And J.D. Porter was quite a politician. He could pat the people on the back and shake their hands and kiss up to the state legislatures, and he got them to transfer the state archives from the state library to the Secretary of State's office, where there would be more support. So that's how they were able to get a big fancy new building and get all the records in. And so I was assigned to cover all the PUDs in Oregon. There were 4 active PUDs. Turned out there were 12, and some of them had gone inactive back in the '30s. So I had to do a lot of research to track down what happened to them and who was still around who would remember them. And so I got to travel all over the state of Oregon. And the biggest PUD was at Newport in Lincoln County. And my grandparents had a cabin on the Siletz River, so I could just stay at my grandparents' cabin and drive down to Newport each day to inventory the records. So I saved the program a lot of money in travel and lodging expenses. But when I was finishing that up, I was driving back to Bellingham that summer to check in at the college, and I stopped at the regional archives in Seattle to say hello to Phil Lothian, who was the director. And he said, "We just got a call from the Eisenhower Library. They have 3 job openings. And Rod Sobers is doing such a good job, they called out here to see if they have any more interns who would like to apply." So I said, "Great." So I went running back to the college and sent in my job application, and I got hired because President Ford had just been voted out of office in the '76 election. So they had to pull people in from all the other presidential libraries to start organizing his White House files. And so there were 3 job openings at the Eisenhower Library. And so I managed to get hired, and I started working in October of that year and spent 31 years there.
At the Eisenhower Library, what were some of your most memorable projects or acquisitions?
Well, I was something of a recluse, and so I enjoyed the archival work because they would say, "Process this collection," and then they would leave me alone for 3 or 4 years while I worked on it. And so I got to do some of the biggest, sexiest collections there. I got to organize part of the White House Central files. In fact, I became kind of their expert on the filing system used in the White House. I got to process some of the National Security Council records. My favorite work was the personal papers, because members of the White House staff or administration officials would donate their own personal papers to the library. And we had some huge collections, like Jacqueline Cochran, who was a famous airplane pilot. She had been director of women pilots during World War II. She was a friend of Amelia Earhart. She helped She had a ranch in Southern California. She helped convince Eisenhower to run for president in 1952. And after he retired from the White House, he would go to Southern California to spend the winters. And he would stay at her ranch and write his memoirs there. Just a second. So Jackie donated all of her papers to the Eisenhower Library. She's one of those pack rats who saved every scrap of paper she got his hands on. It was about almost 480,000 pages. And when I first came there in '77, it was still in the original packing cart. So they had filing cabinets, they had suitcases, and they had cartons full of these papers. It took me 7 years, 9 months to organize the collection. I started in April of '72 and went to December of '89. But so that was the biggest collection I ever worked on. Then I got to do some cabinet officers. Herbert Brownell, the Attorney General, he retired from active law practice when he was 84 and sent us his personal papers. So I got to organize that collection. It was very disappointing. Typical lawyer, never put anything down on paper. But he came to the library to see how we were treating his collection. I got to give him a tour of the stack area to show him where everything was stored. And I pulled out, and I was still organizing his papers at that time, so I pulled out a little box, and here was an old photograph on top. He took one look at the photo and said, "Oh, that's my grandfather." Turned out his grandfather had been Attorney General under Benjamin Harrison.
Oh my goodness.
And he recognized the photo right away, had an incredible memory. I was very impressed. Then I got to process the papers of Robert Anderson, who'd been Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of the Treasury under Eisenhower. And that was a much better collection. That was about 300,000 pages. It took me about 3 or 4 years. And after the end of the administration, he became an investment banker, helped raise venture capital for different projects. And so he had a lot on the oil industry and a lot on foreign policy. So that was a fascinating collection. And then the last big collection I worked on was Abbott Washburn, who'd been Deputy Director of the U.S. Information Agency under Eisenhower. And then later he got appointed to the Federal Communications Commission by Richard Nixon. And so he didn't save much from his Eisenhower years, but boxes and boxes of stuff from the FCC. And he saved a lot of material. That was about 300,000 pages as well. In fact, when we were waiting for years for him to turn loose the material because he kept it in the basement of his house in Maryland. And when he finally died, his family sent us the collection. And the assistant director of the library said, "Well, Tom, this is your new collection. How long do you think it'll take to process it?" And I looked it over and I said, 4 years. 2 years to do the arrangement, 2 years to do the reviewing. And it came out almost exactly 4 years to the very month.
Oh my gosh.
Of course, by that time I was pretty confident of how fast I could do the work. But that was an interesting collection too. So I got to do some fascinating papers. And I got to meet some famous historians who came there to do research, like Stephen Ambrose, who wrote a lot on World War II. By the time I started working there, he was nearing the end of his career. And he was writing for the popular audience. So he would just rampage through the files and take very poor notes. And some of his later books, like his biography of Nixon and his biography of Eisenhower, he cited documents he's never been able to find. The footnotes are practically worthless. So I'm not very impressed with his later work. And I got to meet some notorious people as well. Francis Lowenheim. There was a major scandal at the Roosevelt Library in the late 1960s. Francis Lowenheim had gone there to study some sort of foreign policy topic. And he was in a hurry. This is a story I heard in one of my training courses. He was in a hurry, didn't want to waste a lot of time looking at extraneous material. So he hauled out a few collections that had the most significant files, and he spent a few days going through the material, and then he left. Well, after he'd been there, after several years, a year or two after he'd been at the library, another historian published a book on a similar topic. And this other historian had done very thorough research. He'd spent weeks and weeks at the library tracking down every scrap of paper on the subject. And he cited a few collections that Lowenheim hadn't seen. So Lowenheim raised a big fuss. He claimed that the library deliberately withheld these papers from him because in order to benefit this other historian's research. Well, it caused a major scandal. The National Archives investigated, the American Historical Association investigated, and Congress held hearings. They discovered that the collections they had he was accusing them of withholding had been open to research for years. The finding aids were freely available right there in the research room. The only reason he hadn't seen them is because he was a blundering incompetent who was too lazy and impatient to make a thorough search of the collections. So the whole thing reflected more unfavorably on Lowenheim than it did on the Roosevelt Library. But ever since then, there's a big push at the National Archives. Everybody was indoctrinated. Don't do research for people. If they want something, they have to specify the exact document or the exact file folder. And then you copy that for them. And don't select documents for people. And that was the whole policy while I was an archivist there. But I got to meet Lowenheim because he came to the Eisenhower Library a couple times in the early 80s to do research. And it was always the senior archivist who would wait on him, not a lowly flunky like me who just started working there. So we were very careful to treat him carefully.
Yes. Wow. I can only imagine. With your very long tenure as an archivist, how have you seen the archives world change, whether it be standards or understandings of the profession? I would love to hear your thoughts, archivist to archivist.
Well, the internet made a major impact in the use of computers. Because when I first started at the Eisenhower Library, we were still using manual typewriters. There's no internet, no computers. In fact, I think it was April of '95 when we first got connected to the internet. And then there was a big push to put all of our finding aids digitize all of our finding aids so they could be accessed. So the last couple of years was involved with doing that in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then we started digitizing some of the more sexy documents, like all of Eisenhower's appointment schedules are now online. And we started doing significant documents, like for the past 3 or 4 years since I retired, they started putting declassified documents online. They have a process called mandatory review. If a document is still security classified, we pull it out of the collection and put a little withdrawal sheet in its place and store it in our security vault. And if a historian finds a reference to a document that he thinks might be useful, they can request to be reviewed. And so we make a copy of it and send it to the agencies in Washington that have an interest in the subject matter. And if they say it's no longer sensitive, we can open it to research. And so that's called mandatory review. And if the documents are declassified, they've started posting those online. So you can see the latest stuff that's just been opened. And then we had a process called systematic review. Back in the 90s, I was involved with that a little, where the agencies would send us guidelines to tell us the general subject is still considered sensitive. And if something doesn't fall into one of those subject areas, we can open it. And after the collapse of communism and the unification of Germany in 1990, a lot of our files in Berlin got declassified because now the Berlin's no longer a divided city. There was a lot of planning in the 1950s about what do we do if the Russians blockaded again. It was called Berlin contingency planning. You know, if they blockade this road, how do we get past it? And do we fly in suppliers to try to force through by tanks? And all of a sudden, all of this was no longer sensitive because Berlin was no longer divided. And so we got permission to open all that. Wow. And so thousands of pages of documents, top secret stuff I thought would never see the light of day was being opened right and left. It was an exciting time to be working at the Eisenhower Library. And I got involved with that a little. I didn't have much training. So they said, well, you can do all the routine stuff like the transmittal memos. And so I got to process the chronological file of the National Security Advisor's Office, where the Secretary of the National Security Council would send out copies of their reports and their records of action. And so I got to go through and stamp thousands of pages declassified. But we had trouble with the more higher level stuff like the NATO documents. I can tell you a story about the NATO documents. They won't declassify the military NATO records unless all the countries sign off, and so it's a problem getting all the different countries to agree. And the NATO has a history office. And when I first started working there in the early 80s, there was a fellow named Morris Honeck who was the head of that. And he came to the Eisenhower Library to appear at a conference. And so we took him in the vault and showed him all the NATO documents. He said, "Oh, I can't help you with these. They're still sensitive. We can't declassify anything." Well, after he retired, they hired a fellow named Gregory Pedlow to be the new head of the history office. And we brought him out to the library for another conference and took him in the vault and showed him the classified documents, especially the Lars Norstad papers, because he was a NATO Supreme Commander. And he said, "Oh, I can open this," and he stamped it declassified, and he found another. "Oh, I can open this one," and he stamped it declassified. By the time he left, he'd opened over 1,000 pages.
Wow.
Of course, it was all routine administrative type junk, but still, it was good statistics. And it cleaned out all this routine stuff that didn't need to be saved anymore. So that's some of the declassification.
That's wonderful. So this is part 2 of the Thomas Branigar interview, and for this session we are going to focus on your time at Linfield. And so I would like to ask you about your residence life experience, especially with Anderson Hall.
Okay, I spent all 4 years in the same room, room 212 of Anderson Hall, which is right next to the head of the stairs on the 2nd floor. I had 2 roommates. My first freshman year, I had a fellow named Chris Pritchard from Bellevue, Washington, which is a suburb of Seattle. He was kind of hippie. He wore his hair long. He brought an 8-track tape player and a big stack of rock music tapes, which he played loudly. And I had my revenge. I brought one weekend. I went home and brought back my record player and my collection of classical music tapes, and I would play 1812 Overture with all the cannons roaring in the background, and the William Tell Overture with the chasing at the end, and that would irritate him because he didn't like classical music, I don't think. But he did have one recording of the Moody Blues that I rather enjoyed. And he left after the first year. He transferred to a college up in Washington. And from my last 3 years, I had Craig Hazelbaker, who was from Grangeville, Idaho. And he was kind of a legacy. His parents had gone to Linfield, had an older brother, Sandy, and an older sister, Sandy, and a younger sister, Chris, who were at Linfield the same time we were. And he was complete opposite of Chris Pritchard. Chris was short and slender. Craig was really tall, well over 6 feet, and big husky fellow, and he played football. I had no interest in sports, but I would go to the football games when he was playing to see if he would do a good job. I remember one game in particular, he did a really good play, and the announcer would say, "Hazelbaker tackles, and Hazelbaker blocks, and Hazelbaker intercepts." And right behind him in the stands was this older couple. I heard one of them say, "Who is that Hazelbaker anyway?" I was so proud, I wanted to say, "That's my roommate." But I haven't seen or heard from him since we graduated. Last I heard, he was farming near Grangeville. I think he inherited his parents' ranch. But those were my roommates. Chris, my first year, he was kind of a practical joker. He drove a little black and white car, a foreign import called a Carmen Ghia, and it was sat really low to the ground. When I registered for the draft, when I turned 18, he drove me downtown so I could register. It was a real struggle to get into it and out of it. And one day, it was an April Fool's joke in 1971. He drove it into the Student Center in Riley Hall. In fact, he and a couple of friends were planning the prank, and I walked in on them while they were working on this, so I knew something was being planned, but I didn't think they would actually go through with it. And what they did, one of them hid in the Student Center at the end of the day when it was being locked up, and so he was able to open the doors. And another of them got some wood from someplace and laid it up on the steps leading up to the patio. And then Chris just drove his car up onto the patio and through the double doors into the lounge area, which is where Starbucks is now. And he did that on April 1st as an April Fool's joke. And I got up early the next morning and walked over there, and there was this car right out in the middle of the lounge area. And I heard a rumor that somebody in the administration called the police, and when there was no report of the car having been stolen, they realized it was just a student prank. So nobody did anything, paid no attention to it. And I think Chris was rather disappointed at the lack of a reaction.
Well, yeah. Mm-hmm. What were some of the extracurricular activities that you were involved in?
Well, most of the dorms had athletic teams. I know Anderson had a football team and a basketball team, and I tried to avoid those since I had no athletic ability. In fact, there was only one time when I got involved with the basketball team. They were short a man, and I got into the Riley gym. to watch it. And they said, hey, Branigar, we need an extra guy. Will you play? I said, no, I'm no good at it. They said, oh, come on. So I went down on the floor, stumbled out there, and they threw me the ball. I was looking around, what do I do with this? And the referee blew his whistle, and he said, foul on Branigar. And I hadn't touched anybody. I was nowhere near anyone. And I said, what did I do wrong? And he said, you stood for 3 seconds inside the key. And I'd never heard of that rule before. And there was a brief instant where I thought he was just making it up to humiliate me. And I was standing there, what do I do? And off in the stands, I heard somebody starting to laugh. And I was so humiliated. So I never again played basketball. But that's the type of thing I had to put up with in sports. But I did enjoy a few classes. I took some, they encouraged us to take some PE courses to get exercise. So I signed up for a handball course, which I rather enjoyed. I signed up for badminton and a table tennis course. Table tennis was taught by Arthur Kimball from the English department because he was fairly good at it. And I came in last in the course. And I tied for last place with Bonnie Rasmussen, tall, slender, blonde, very attractive lady. I think she later became a minister. But neither of us did very well in that course. And I took a bowling course. We'd go to the bowling alley across Baker Street and south a ways, and I didn't do very well there either. It was a good day if I could break 100. So I was pretty incompetent when it came to sports. But I got involved with the college radio station briefly too. I can tell you a little bit about the radio station.
Yes, because I believe the radio station just got started during your time at Linfield.
Yes, it was in Fryricks Hall, the original Fryricks, which burned down in December of '69. And all their equipment was destroyed, all the record collection was destroyed. So they had to raise some money to start the station again, and they put it in the basement of Pioneer Hall, a little room down there. And I'm not familiar with the technical details, but I think it was a very weak signal. They transmitted it over electrical lines, and it could only reach across campus. Mm-hmm. And so they were able to do it very cheaply. And then some people wanted to get a more professional organization. It went back on the air in the fall of '70, about a year after the fire. But there was a push to get a more powerful transmitter. And so they raised some money. The Student Senate appropriated some money, and a number of donations were received, and they bought a more powerful transmitter that could reach 16 miles. And so they had to get a special license from the FCC. And Dr. Craig Singletary in the communications department was the faculty advisor. So he managed to get the license. And it turned out that our call letters at that time were KLIN. It turned out that was being used by a radio station in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so they had to reassign the call letters. And so starting in the fall of '71, we were KSLC. And so that's how we got our current call letters. And the transmitter was installed in the fall of '71, at the start of my sophomore year, and went on the air in January, I think it was. And since they were getting a more powerful transmitter, they wanted a more professional staff to run it. So they put out a call for people to volunteer as disc jockeys and as news reporters. And since I enjoyed writing, I thought maybe I could help with the news reporting. So I volunteered for the news staff. And so there were several other people who became involved at that time, later went on into careers in journalism, like Gary Hill, who lived in Anderson Hall for a while. He was on the news staff. He later became a reporter for a Portland, Oregon television station. In fact, I would come out in the late '80s, early '90s. I'd come out here to visit my parents on vacation. We'd turn on the evening news, and there would be Gary Hill giving the news. And I thought, well, I know that guy. And then John Axtell, who also lived in Anderson, got his start on the radio station. He got a job working at a radio station in Nebraska. I think he's either their news or their sports director. And so he would, every couple of years, he'd come through Abilene on vacation. I'd take him out to lunch, and we would reminisce about our Linfield years. So that was always enjoyable. So a few people got their journalism starts at the Linfield radio station. But I didn't do well at all. Part of the problem was they wanted me to collect news. And so they'd say, well, call all the departments, all the academic departments, see if there was any news. So they'd put me down in front of the telephone. I'd call the chemistry department and say, do you have any news? And they'd say, no. So sorry to bother you. And I'd call the next department, do you have any news? And sorry to bother you. And so since I hated talking on the phone, I was very uncomfortable with that. In fact, I can tell you one incident in particular. In January of '72, there was a break-in in the psychology department. Somebody broke into the lab in the basement of Pioneer Hall and trashed some of the equipment, and there's a bit of damage. And so they signed me to see what I could find out about the break-in. So I thought, well, maybe they've issued a statement, we'll have everything I need. So and I knew that statements came from the president's office. So I called Dr. Bjork's office and asked if they'd issued a statement on the break-in. And the secretary said, well, just a minute, let me check. And so she put me on hold. A moment later, a man came out. It was Dr. Bjork. I panicked. You know, here I was a lowly sophomore. I was talking with the president of the college. So I finally managed to ask him if he had issued a statement on the break-in. And he said no. He was rather gruff about it. And so I panicked again. So I apologized for disturbing him, got off the phone as fast as I could. But there's little things like that that made me realize I was not cut out to be a reporter. But I still had to find stuff on the break-in. So I called the psychology department and talked to Dr. Duke, Jim Duke, who was the chairman. He said, sure, come on over, I'll tell you what happened. So I went to the psychology department, and he gave me a tour of the lab and showed me where the break-in was. And I got a lot of good stuff from him. So I wrote up a little account of the incident and turned it into the news staff. I don't know if they ever used it, but it was a good experience. But I only lasted for a couple months before I got really sick of calling people on the phone, and I turned in my resignation. But it was an interesting experience.
And I believe you're also, was it the business manager for Anderson Hall?
Oh yes. Each dorm had their own little organization. There was a head resident, which is kind of like the manager of the place. And then each year they would elect a kind of a group to organize, run the place. There was a president, vice president, secretary, and the treasurer, and the senator who would represent the dorm of the student senate. And they would have an election at the end of the school year to select people for the coming year. That way they could elect people who they knew would be back. And then they would have another election at the start of the year to confirm this, and if anyone didn't show up, they could fill the position. Mm-hmm. And so at the end of my freshman year, I got elected business manager because there wasn't enough business to keep the secretary and the treasury busy. So they combined it and called it the business manager and gave it to me. Ended up serving for 3 years. And I think I got that partly because of what I did with Sir Richard Allen. He was the head resident of New Dorm, which is now Fryricks Hall. It was the newest dorm on campus at that time, and it was the only co-ed dorm. And so they brought him in as a special visiting professor. He had been a retired British diplomat. He had been ambassador to Burma and minister to Argentina. And he taught a course on international relations. And it was only a 1-year appointment. And this was my freshman year. And so I signed up for his course in the spring. It was a really interesting course because there were only a few students who took it. And so we would sit around in the lounge at New Dorm, and he would discuss the major political issues of the day, international problems. And he would tell us stories from his diplomatic career, like when he was in Argentina, he got to know Juan and Eva Perón. And when he was in Burma, he got to know Zhou Enlai of China. And he was saying how Juan Perón was the brains of the pair. He didn't think much of Eva. And he said, Juan Perón and Zhou Enlai were birds of a feather. They were both clever rogues. That's the phrase he used, clever rogues. They would pat you on the back and shake your hand and make you think like you were the greatest guy in the world, even if they hated your guts.
Wow.
So you pick up little things like that from Sir Richard. And his wife, Lady Juliet, was also active on campus. They put on a play called The Lion in Winter, which was a play about Henry II of England. And Lady Juliet helped design the costumes. And so, I think it was Noel Augustine, who's head resident of Anderson Hall. He told me that her grandfather had been Archbishop of Canterbury, and she'd inherited his signet ring.
Wow. Wow.
So anyway, I found them really interesting, real life night on campus. So I wanted to do something nice for him. And I looked him up in Who's Who. And it said his birthday was in February. So I thought maybe I'll do something nice for his birthday. So the week before his birthday, I went out and bought a birthday card. I took it around and had everybody in Anderson Hall sign it. And the morning of his birthday, I got up early and went over to New Dorm and taped it to the front door of their apartment. Lady Juliet later wrote a really nice thank you note and brought it over to Anderson Hall and put it on the bulletin board in the lower hall. But some people were saying that since I'd gotten the birthday card and had everyone sign it, I was pretty well organized. And so I think that was one of the factors that got me elected business manager. And as business manager, I had three main duties. The dorm had a small checking account, and they took magazine subscriptions. So I had to go to the post office each day and pick up their magazines. And one was Sports Illustrated, and I think there was one or two of the major news magazines. And so I bring them back from the post office and put them in the lounge for everyone to read. And the first year I did this, the post office was in the main floor of Pioneer Hall. There was a branch post office there. And so they gave me the combination of the post office box and to pick up the magazine subscriptions every day. Then when I got reelected and came back during my junior year, I went to the post office and it was no longer there. They had taken out all the post office boxes and walled in the area, and it's now used as a bulletin board. So the main post office was in Riley Hall, right across from the bookstore. It's now the display cabinets. But that's where the post office was. So I had to go to the postmistress, Mary Moody, and ask what happened to Anderson Hall's post office box. And so she gave me the new box number and the new combination so I could continue picking up the subscriptions. But there was a little door in the main hallway in Pioneer Hall that they used to get behind the post office boxes to sort the mail. And a couple of years ago, I was walking through Pioneer Hall on a visit, and the door was open. And so I looked inside, and you could still see the outline on the floor where the original wall was, where they had the post office boxes.
Wow.
But I'm pretty sure they took this out in the summer of '72, between my junior and sophomore junior years. And since then, I used the main post office in Riley Hall. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of my duties. Another duty is keeping the pop machine filled. We had a pop machine with soft drinks, and the pop company would make a delivery every week. And we had a small checking account, so I'd have to write a check for the pop and give it to the guy and get the receipt for our records. And they put the pop bottles in a big pile inside the janitor's closet next to the pop machine. So I'd have to, they'd give me the key to the pop machine, then every day I'd have to take bottles out of the supply and put them in the pop machine. And if I went home for the weekend, they'd drink all the pop, and then when I got back on Sunday afternoon, the machine would be empty and everybody would be complaining about there was no pop, so I'd have to hurry and fill it, and then they'd have to wait for it to get cold. But for some reason, they kept re-electing me.
Guess it wasn't too bad then.
No, but it was more a matter of finding a sucker to do the work.
I think you did such a good job, they gave you a gift.
Yes, at the end of my sophomore year, after my first year as business manager, they gave me a Linfield beer mug. And they also gave me a thank you card, Big Tom, and everyone in the dorm signed it. In fact, Reed Blackburn, who later got killed in the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, is one of the signatures. So now I can boast that I have his autograph. But Reed Blackburn was very much involved with the Linnews, the college newspaper. Even from our earliest days of our freshman year, he would take really beautiful pictures. And in fact, I can tell you a couple stories about his photographic work. There was a time when the Oregon Symphony sent a small ensemble to the college to do a performance. It was held in the basketball court in Riley Gym. They later took it out. Walker Hall and Riley Hall used to be connected, and the area in between them were the walkway is now was the basketball court. And so they would play basketball games in there, and that's where the Oregon Symphony set up for their program. And so I like classical music, so I went to hear the program. About halfway through, I saw Reed Blackburn crawling along the wall. He crawled right out in the middle of the orchestra and took a picture looking up at the conductor. He'd do anything for a picture. Wow. And the other story I remember about him was our graduation ceremonies at the end of May 1974, when we got our bachelor's degrees. We were in alphabetical order, so Blackburn and Branigar were very close together. In fact, I think there was only one person between us, Carol Bach, who later married Steve Rooney, and they live in Bend. She could probably remember this incident well, too. But we were sitting in the row waiting to receive our diplomas, and I saw he had his camera slung around his neck. So the way the ceremony worked, Dr. Dolan was handing out the diplomas. He'd read the student's name and hand the diploma to Gordon Bjork, who was the president who was handing them out. And the student would climb up on the platform, and he would get the diploma from Dr. Bjork and shake hands and get down. Well, Reed had his camera slung around his neck when he climbed up on the platform. And when Dr. Bjork was held up his diploma, Reed took a picture of the president holding the diploma. And then Dr. Bjork gave the diploma to Reed, and Reed gave the camera to Dr. Bjork. And Dr. Bjork took a picture of Reed Blackburn holding his diploma. The whole audience just roared with laughter because everybody knew what a dedicated photographer Reed was.
That's lovely.
And then he got a job with the newspaper in Longview, Washington, and got killed when he was taking pictures of Mount St. Helens during the eruption in May of 1980.
Mm-hmm. I would love to ask, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, one of my other duties as business manager was keeping the phone directory. Because in those days there was no phones, no cell phones, no internet. In fact, there were not even phones in the individual rooms. There was one phone in Anderson Hall. It was in a little recess in the wall at the foot of the stairs on the first floor. And there was a row of buttons on the wall next to the phone. And each button rang a buzzer over the door in each room. And so if somebody wanted to talk to somebody in the dorm, they would call the phone. I still remember the phone number, 472-9929 was Anderson Hall's phone number. And they had we had to know which button rang which room. And so the head resident would give me a directory of the list of people assigned to each room. And I would put a little label next to each button, like for room 212, Branigar, Tom Branigar, 1 ring, Craig Hazelbaker, 2 rings. So if Craig got a call, they would ring our buzzer twice, and then we know to come downstairs. And so it was my job to keep that directory up to date when somebody transferred. So I had to keep track of who was in the dorm and which room they were living in.
Wow.
And then I think my junior year, they got a second phone. It was put in the janitor's closet on the 3rd floor. So you didn't have to run all the way downstairs if you wanted to make a phone call. But if somebody wanted you, you still had to call the first floor, the main phone on the first floor, so we can ring the buzzers. And there was a guy in our dorm named Lance Powell. He was an Afro-American from Connecticut. He had this loud, piercing voice. You could hear him talking all over the dorm if he got into full volume. But I think they elected him dorm president our senior year. But he had this practical joke of putting shaving cream on the earphone. Then he would say, hey, you've got a phone call, and you pick up the phone and listen, and you get an earful of shaving cream. And nobody was ever able to catch him at that because he was so careful about it. But somebody finally did, and there's much rejoicing throughout the dorm.
It sounds like you guys had a good time.
Yeah, we had our share parties. Every once in a while, somebody would bring in some pizza, or they'd bring in a keg of beer, and we'd have a party. And there were lots of college parties as well. Like every once in a while, they have a party or a dance in Dillon Hall. They'd move the tables back and have a dance. And I can remember one in particular. They hired a band to provide the music, and it was so loud you could hear it at Anderson Hall. And I was not a social person at all, so I tended to avoid these big parties, but I went over to see what was happening. And shortly after I got there, the band took a break. And while they were off stage, 3 or 4 of the professors got up and sang some songs. And I was really surprised because one of them was Dr. Dolan, who always seemed so distinguished. Another one was Clarence Heinrichs from the physics department. And I remember the songs they sang because one was really slow and serious and reverential. And then the second song was a parody of Let Every Good Fellow, and I still remember a couple of lines. It said, let every professor now join in the song, Viva la faculty, and A to the girls and the C to the men, Viva la faculty. And the whole audience just loved it.
Yeah. That sounds very creative and a lot of fun. So this leads, I think, beautifully into a question that Tara crafted. So I'll read it to you, and it's, your letters pretty thoroughly capture your stimulating experiences with faculty, student activities, beer, film culture, and academic politics. How would you relate your life in the 1970s, often remembered for its musical and fashion revolution, national politics such as the Cold War, and social movements, to your experiences on and off campus?
Oh, gee.
Yes, she's very good at her questions. And we can break that down too. Basically, what was going on in the larger world, how did that affect Linfield, or did it?
Not really. There was a lot of student protest in some of the big campuses. In fact, I can remember fall of 1970, right at the start of my freshman year, our head resident of Anderson was Noel Augustin, who I think was one of the deans. And we had kind of a get acquainted meeting in the lounge. And he asked each freshman, each new person, why did they attend Linfield? And a lot of us said to get an education or to avoid the draft, because they still had student deferments in those days. I can remember one person in particular, Ken Brown, had just transferred in from the University of Oregon. And he said he had been at the university and he was sitting outside someplace minding his own business, and a big mob of students came by and somebody shouted, let's go set fire to the administration building. And off they went, and he said, I've got to get out of here. So I think going to Linfield was a matter of a small, quiet place where people could get an education and not be too much concerned with the outside world. And I knew there was a drug problem on campus. There were rumors and reports in the Linnews of drug raids. In fact, just a couple of weeks after the start of the semester, fall of 70, my roommate Chris Pritchard said, hey, I found out we can get marijuana, would you like some? And I said, no thanks. But I was surprised because it was so close to the start of the semester. And he wasn't from this area, he was from the Seattle area. So it only took him a couple weeks to make contact with the local drug culture.
Wow. Okay. One question that I have that's technically not scripted here is, Dr. Bjork has been sort of a mystery for us for Linfield history. Since you were able to be a student while he was there, can you speak a bit about him or what he did at Linfield? Well,
I've heard rumors since I graduated, mostly talking with Elmer Milligan in the history department. I would come back once or twice a year and stop by to see him. And the story I heard is that Bjork did not enjoy fundraising. He didn't go out and try to bring in the money. So as a result, Linfield didn't have a very good cash flow. And by the time he left, it was largely very close to bankruptcy. In fact, my senior year, fall of my spring of 74, the faculty passed a no confidence vote. And I think Dr. Jacobs in the history department was one of the pushers of that, because they realized that because of his financial policies, the college wasn't doing very well. And I remember Dr. Beckham got up in history class, this was history of the American West, and he said something to the effect that this is a betrayal of the president and we shouldn't have done this and we should support the president in his efforts to keep the college running. And I remember being puzzled why he was discussing college politics in the middle of a history class. Well, talking to Dr. Milligan years later, after Dr. Beckham had moved away, the story I heard is that Beckham and Bjork were very close friends. And Beckham was one of Bjork's greatest supporters among the faculty. And so when Dr. Jacobs pushed through this vote of no confidence, there was a bit of professional rivalry between Beckham and Jacobs. I think that's another reason why Beckham wasn't very happy at Linfield. But according to what I heard, the trustees refused to, once the no confidence vote was passed by the faculty, Bjork turned in his resignation to the Board of Trustees and refused to accept it. And so he insisted on resigning anyway, since he had lost the trust of the faculty. And so he resigned that summer, and then Dr. Win Dolan, who was vice president, was acting president for a couple of months until they hired Cornelius Siemens as the interim president.
Mm-hmm. Wow, okay. Thank you. And in fact, as a side note, we had the opportunity to meet Dr. Beckham last week.
Oh.
So hopefully we'll get an opportunity to speak with Dr. Bjork since they're still in touch.
Oh, good.
So we've been trying to gather facts from those who knew him, just because it is quite a mystery still. So I do have one last question here, and it's another Tira question, so it's beautifully scripted. And as an alumnus, highly successful archivist, and historian at heart, what philosophy of learning and achieving would you impart to the Linfield community? So basically, what advice, I guess, in your wonderful life so far would you impart?
Well, since it was largely Linfield that got me interested in history as a profession, I think the best thing to say is study as many different areas as you can, because eventually you'll find something that you're interested in and you can make a career out of it. Because that's what I did. I started out in math and science, and I tried journalism at the radio station. That didn't work, and I enjoyed math, but it wasn't the type of thing I could make a career in. And finally found I was good at archival work, working with old documents. So the best thing you can do at college is to find a field that you're good at.
And is there anything I didn't ask Tom that I should have, or anything that you want to talk about before we finish?
More social activities. When the Linfield Little Theater was in the Friarix Hall, which burned down, and so they had to put it in the conference room on the main floor of Pioneer Hall. It was very cramped. I went to a few programs there, and all they did was put on a few small plays, and then for anything really elaborate like musicals, they used the Melrose Auditorium. So I enjoyed some of the performances they put on. I went to see a Marat Sod, and I went to see Lion in Winter, and went to see Comedy of Errors by Shakespeare. They put that on. They put on The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan. And they also showed films in Melrose Auditorium. Charles Kirby was the projectionist. He was in my year, and he later became a gourmet chef. But he would get up on the stage and explain what the movie was about, and then he'd get up in the projection booth and show the movie. And remember one Halloween they showed Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, which was really, really exciting. And the lights were down low, and just one of the key moments where Norman Bates comes out to stab the hero, somebody screamed, and the whole audience is going to gasp. I took one of the core courses was film appreciation. It was in communications, and that was a 3-part program. I took that in the fall of '71, I think. They divided up into 3 different courses. One was journalism from Charlotte Filer on how to write newspaper articles and interpret them. One was creative writing from Ken Erickson, where you got to write your own short stories, and I enjoyed that because I did writing. And then one was film analysis, which was also taught by Ken Erickson. He would bring films in, show them to the class, and we would debate what they were about, why they were significant. And I remember one case he brought in The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, which was largely a Dr. Seuss work. That's where a little kid falls asleep and dreams he's being held prisoner by his piano teacher. And so I could relate to that after all the teachers I had in high school. And so after it was over, Dr. Erickson apologized for inflicting a children's film on us because he hadn't seen it before, and he thought it was some profound statement of the human condition. And I thought, what is he talking about? It's a great movie. So I rather enjoyed that. And they had parties in the fall, in the spring, usually in April. They had something called the Flying Fowl Festival, or Flying Fowl Fair, which was the spring activities. And there was something called a bed race, where they put wheels on a bed and pushed it across campus. And each dorm could enter and had a bed race. And then they usually sponsored a picnic out in the country. In '72, it was at a little farm out near the hills southwest of McMinnville. And I remember driving out there and parking at the top of the hill and walking down the hill to the edge of the trees where they had a picnic area set up. And they had lunch there. And then the next year, it was 73, I think, they had it over at another farm just over the line in Polk County. And it was a cloudy, rainy day. And so I drove out there, and it was so miserable. Everybody's huddling inside a barn to keep dry. So I turned around and came back to campus. And then I found out later that another car coming back to campus had skidded off the road, and a student was killed. It was Jim Thomas, who was in my year, but I didn't know him. He was the son of Steve Thomas, who was on the grounds crew. In fact, Steve Thomas was later killed when he fell out of a tree while trimming it. That was several years later. But they had a memorial service for Jim in the Miller's Auditorium. I didn't know him at all, but I went to the service because Barry Tucker was giving the eulogy, and he was the head resident of Anderson Hall that year. He did a really good job. So there was problems in campus as well as lots of social activities. And I got more speaking skills. My history professors helped me develop those, because after I wrote my paper on the Hooker murder for Pacific Northwest history, Dr. Milling said, well, maybe you could give a talk about this someplace. And I said, okay, I'll try. And so he knew Kenneth Holmes, who used to be a history professor here back in the early 60s. And he transferred to Oregon College of Education in Monmouth. So he called Ken Holmes and he said, hey, one of my students had just written a paper on Polk County history. Maybe you could have him give a talk to the local historical society. And I joined the Polk County Historical Society the year I graduated from high school in 1970. So I knew I'd been some of their meetings. I knew some of the people who were officers. And so they said, how would you like to give a talk on the Hooker murder? I said, sure. So at their April 1972 meeting, I went to the high school of Perrydale where they were holding their meeting and gave a talk about the Hooker murder. And so that's the earliest time I had. The first time I did volunteer work for the County Historical Society. And then after I did my paper on the Kelty lynching, Dr. Beckham said, how would you like to give a talk about this? And I said, okay, I'll do it. So he called the Yamhill County Historical Society and got me to talk at one of their meetings. I think it was in April of '74. And so he drove me over to the meeting. I can't remember where it was. It was here in McMinnville. And I was so nervous because I didn't know any of the people at all. So I kind of stammered and looked at my notes instead of making eye contact with the audience. And on the way back to the college, I apologized for giving such a poor talk. And Dr. Beckham said, what do you mean? You had them on the edge of their seat. Because the guy who was accused of leading the lynch mob was from Yamhill County, lived up near Carlton. And it turned out that some of the members of the society had known his grandchildren.
Oh, wow.
So that was an interesting event, but it got me more experience in giving public performances, public lectures.
Wonderful.
So a lot of this experience I got here at Linfield, which is a big help to my career.
Is there any last thoughts you want to share?
Not really.
Quite a bit. All right. Well, thank you very much, Tom, for taking the time to share your stories with us. We're going to go ahead and conclude the recording, and then we'll go get some lunch.
That'd be nice. Thank you.